There are moments in an interview where time seems to stop. Not because of some dramatic explosion, not because someone breaks down crying, but because one sentence, spoken calmly, without hesitation, hits everyone in the room so hard that no one knows how to react. That's what happened tonight, inside the Apple Music studio, with cameras rolling in Zane Lowe, a man who has interviewed hundreds of the biggest artists on the planet. Sitting directly across from ParkJimin, the man went silent, his mouth slightly open, his eyes fixed on Jimin like he was seeing him for the very first time. And the entire room froze with him. But to truly understand why that moment happened, we need to go back. All the way back. Today, March 20th, 2026, BTS released Arirang, their 10th studio album, their 6th in Korean, and their first in nearly 4 years. 4 years. Think about that. 4 years without a new album from a group that once broke nearly every Billboard record that existed. 4 years without a single joint concert from 7 men who used to sell out 90,000-seat stadiums in minutes. And now, on the very same day as the album's release, BTS sat down in front of Zane Lowe for their first ever Apple Music interview, and Jimin said something that left the most experienced music journalist in the industry completely speechless. Zane Lowe is not just anyone. This is the man who once made Kanye West cry in a studio. The man who interviewed Taylor Swift in the quiet before a massive album drop. The man who has sat across from Drake, Billie Eilish, Harry Styles, Beyoncé, almost every major name you've ever heard. He knows how to read a room. He knows when to push and when to give space. And tonight, he was not ready. We need to talk about what Arirang actually is, because this is not just another comeback album. Big Hit Music described it as something that captures BTS's identity as a group born in Korea. But that's too simple. Arirang is the name of a Korean folk song that is 600 years old. A song that speaks of longing, sorrow, and the resilience of the Korean people. A song sung by mothers in villages when their children left home. A song sung by people separated from their homeland. A song that to this day still feels like a prayer, not for one person, but for an entire nation. And BTS chose that name for their comeback album. Not something cool, not something futuristic. Not an English name that would roll easily off the tongue for listeners in America and Europe. They chose Arirang. They chose something heavy, something loaded with meaning, something that even Korean people themselves cannot hear without feeling something deep in their chest. The album has 14 tracks. It opens with Body to Body, a track that layers traditional Korean percussion over an intensely modern production. Then comes Hooligan, Aliens, FY, which is a wild Jersey club anthem, 2.0 produced by Michael Made It, and number 29 serving as an interlude. At the center of the album sits Swim, the lead single, the only track listed with a black background in the official tracklist announcement, which immediately signals that this is the heart of the entire project. After that comes Merry Go Round produced by Kevin Parker of Tame Impala, Normal, like Animals, They Don't Know About Us, One More Night, Please, and then everything converges on the final track, Into the Sun. Into the Sun. And Jimin's name is on it. Jimin is one of 7 BTS members who received songwriting credits on this album. He wrote on They Don't Know About Us, and on Into the Sun, the closing track that critics have already called the most powerful statement in BTS's entire discography. The Hollywood Reporter wrote that Into the Sun is proof that BTS now occupies a league of their own, a space beyond any boundary ever set for them by anyone else. The final line of the song, I'll Follow You Into the Sun, is not just about ARMY following BTS. It's about BTS following ARMY right back. A promise that runs in both directions. And Jimin helped write that line. When BTS first settled into that couch at the Apple Music studio, the energy felt like a reunion happening live on camera. 7 people who had spent nearly 4 years living separate lives, 2 of those years inside the South Korean military, were sitting together again. There was something different about them. Something more settled in the way they moved, the way they laughed, the way they looked at each other when one of them spoke. Zane opened with the question everyone already had in their head. What does it feel like to be back? Some members answered in ways you could have predicted. Someone talked about gratitude. Someone talked about how much they missed the stage. Someone laughed and said it felt like they'd gone nowhere at all, and also like they'd traveled an impossibly long distance. All of those answers were honest. All of them were warm. But none of them knocked Zane silent. Then Zane turned. metaphorically and literally, toward Jimin. Zane already knew about Into the Sun. He'd read the songwriting credits. He'd listened to the album. And he asked directly, what did it feel like to write the closing track of his album? Jimin didn't answer right away. There was a pause. Not an awkward one, more like the pause of someone deciding how deep they want to go, how honest they're willing to be. And then he spoke. He said that during his time in the military, there were many nights where he asked himself, is any of this real? Does BTS actually exist? Or was it all just a very long dream that happened before he became an ordinary soldier in a small country called South Korea? Not a dramatic question, not a complaint, just a very human question from someone whose life had changed so completely, so rapidly, that the version of himself from before almost felt fictional. And then, this is the part that made Zane go quiet. Jimin said, when I was writing Into the Sun, I wasn't writing it for ARMY. I was writing it for myself on those nights. For the version of me sitting in a barracks room, not knowing if any of this would still be here when I got out. The room went still. Zane Lowe, the man who has interviewed thousands of artists, the man who almost never loses his words, sat there for several seconds without saying anything. Not because he had no follow-up question, but because there are moments where the best response is silence and letting the words stay in the air a little longer. And it is not a coincidence that that moment came from Jimin. Since the very beginning of BTS's career, Jimin has always been the hardest member to define. Not because he's mysterious, it's actually the opposite. He is the member most open about his self-doubt, most honest about his struggles, most willing to stand on a stage with every single emotion fully visible. While other members built polished and controlled public personas, Jimin always looked like someone feeling everything in real time. And that is exactly what makes his songwriting so powerful. They Don't Know About Us, the other track carrying Jimin's writing credit, is one of the most personal songs on the entire album. The title alone tells the story. They don't know about us, about what happens behind the scenes, about everything that has to be endured before a single song can be born, about everything that is never visible on camera, in the media, to a world that only ever sees the finished product. And Jimin was at the center of writing it. We need to talk about the timeline for a moment, because it matters. BTS started working on Arirang in July 2025, in Los Angeles, across months of songwriting sessions. They worked with Diplo, who has already called this the craziest album he's ever been part of, with Ryan Tedder of One Republic, with Flume, with Michael Made It, with Kevin Parker of Tame Impala. This is not a normal producer list. This is a collaboration that has never happened before in the history of K-pop. And in the middle of all those massive names, Jimin sat in the studio and wrote. On November 1st, 2025, it was Jimin who first told ARMY that the album was finished. Not through a press release, not through an official big hit statement. Jimin himself posted on Weverse, the album is ready. Like someone who had been holding something very tightly for a very long time, finally being able to breathe. And now the album exists. It's been released. Anyone anywhere in the world can hear it. Even before the official drop, Arirang had surpassed 5 million pre-saves on Spotify, making BTS the first K-pop act, the first Asian act, the first male act, and the first group to ever reach that number. The only other artist to ever be in that position is Taylor Swift. But back to the Apple Music studio. Back to Zane Lowe sitting in silence. After those few seconds passed, Zane finally spoke. And what he said wasn't a follow-up question. It wasn't a transition to the next topic. He said, I didn't expect to hear that today. And Jimin laughed softly. Not the laugh of someone pleased that they'd caught Zane off guard. The laugh of someone who is simply used to that reaction. Someone who knows that whenever he speaks honestly, the world is always slightly unprepared. This isn't the first time Jimin has made people stop with his honesty. But there was something different about tonight. There was a weight that had been lifted. There was a 4-year distance that could finally be spoken about freely. There was an album that was finished, already in the hands of millions, no longer needing to be protected as a secret. And in that freedom, Jimin could finally say what actually happened. Zane then asked about Into the Sun more specifically, about its final line, about I'll follow you into the sun. And Jimin explained that the song started as a letter to himself, but in the process of writing it, it slowly became something bigger. Every time he wrote the word you, he originally meant it for his past self, but then realized that you could mean anyone. It could mean the other members. It could mean army. It could mean everyone who has ever felt the same thing. The uncertainty about the future. The fear that everything beautiful might eventually disappear. And here is where something interesting happened between the members. When Jimin was talking about this, there was a moment where V, who also has a credit on Into the Sun, nodded very slowly. Not for the camera, not as a performance, but the nod of someone who knows exactly what's being talked about because he was there when the song was being written. Arirang is an album about identity, about where you come from, about what you carry when you travel very far from home. And there is no BTS member who embodies that theme more powerfully than Jimin, the boy from Busan who grew up studying dance in a small studio, who almost didn't make it through his big hit audition, who spent years battling insecurity about whether he was good enough, talented enough, worthy enough to stand alongside the other 6. And now his name is on the closing track of the biggest album in K-pop history. Zane ended the Jimin segment of the interview with one final question. He asked, if you had to describe Arirang in a single word, what would you choose? And Jimin answered without hesitation. One word. In Korean. A word that has no perfect translation in English, but roughly means the longing for something that may never have existed, yet still feels completely real. Zane Lowe went quiet again. And this time he smiled. Let's sit with that for a second. Because what just happened in that studio is not something that gets talked about enough when people discuss Jimin. There is a narrative that has followed him for years, that he is the dancer, the performer, the one whose artistry lives in his body and his movement. And none of that is wrong. Jimin is one of the most gifted performers of his generation. But what gets missed in that framing is the depth of what's happening in his mind. The level of emotional intelligence it takes to sit in a room with Zane Lowe, with cameras pointed at your face, with the weight of a 4-year absence sitting on your shoulders, and choose to say the true thing instead of the easy thing. Most artists in that position would have given a safe answer. Something about how writing the album felt healing. Something about how grateful they were to be back. Something that sounds honest enough to satisfy the question but protects the interior. Jimin didn't do that. He opened a door that most people keep locked during press runs, during promotional cycles, during moments when the whole world is watching. He said, I was scared. I didn't know if this would still exist. And I wrote my way through that fear. That is not a PR moment. That is a confession. And confessions like that, in front of Zane Lowe, on Apple Music, on the day your album drops, they don't happen by accident. They happen because someone has done enough internal work to no longer be afraid of the truth. Think about what the last 4 years actually looked like for Jimin specifically. In 2024, he released his solo work. He built a fan base that went beyond BTS, beyond K-pop, into something that crossed every demographic and geographic boundary. He performed on stages by himself, carried shows that were entirely dependent on his name, his voice, his presence. And then he walked away from all of it and went into the military. Swapped a tour bus for a bunk bed. Swapped a concert stage for a training field. For 2 years. And in those 2 years, he wrote, that's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. The military didn't pause Jimin's creative process, it deepened it. Because when you strip away the schedule, the press junkets, the choreography rehearsals, the social media, all the noise that comes with being one of the most famous people on earth, what you are left with is just a person and their thoughts. And Jimin used that space. He came out the other side with songs that are now on one of the most anticipated albums in music history. Into the Sun didn't come from a writing retreat in Malibu. It didn't come from a session with a team of 10 co-writers in a luxury studio. It came from a barracks room, from someone asking themselves the hardest question a person in his position can ask. What if this is over? And then choosing, slowly and deliberately, to write the answer. The answer was, I'll follow you into the sun. That's the line. That's what Jimin wrote when he was staring at the ceiling at night, not knowing what came next. And now that line is going to be heard by millions of people around the world who have their own version of that same fear. Their own barracks room, their own dark night, their own uncertainty about whether the thing they love most will still be there when they come out the other side. That's why Zane smiled. Not because the interview went well, not because BTS delivered good talking points, but because he recognized in real time that he had just witnessed something rare. A person being completely honest about what it costs to create something, and choosing to share that cost openly without performing it. Tomorrow night, March 21st, BTS will take the stage at Gwanghwamun Square, one of the most iconic public spaces in South Korea, with the centuries-old Gyeongbokgung Palace rising behind them as a backdrop. That concert will be streamed live on Netflix to the entire world. And 1 week after that, on March 27th, the documentary BTS, The Return will premiere, giving the world a complete picture of how this album was born, of the journey from military barracks to a studio in Los Angeles, of 7 people who were separated and eventually found their way back to each other with one shared mission. But tonight, inside the Apple Music studio, the most memorable thing is not a concert that hasn't happened yet, not a documentary that hasn't aired yet. The most memorable thing is one small moment. Jimin speaks, Zane goes silent, and everyone watching at home feels that something very real is happening on their screen. This isn't scripted. This isn't PR. This isn't a marketing strategy designed in a conference room. This is just Jimin, speaking honestly, like he always does. And that, more than any album, more than any record, more than any streaming number, is the reason ParkJimin cannot be ignored. See you in the next one.